Hi, my name is Fabrizio De Donno. I'm a senior lecturer in Italian and comparative literature, and I'm also the convener of the core module for liberal arts, the second year core module for liberal arts, which is entitled Power, Society and Cultural Practice. Now, this is a course where we tend to look at societal issues, real-world issues, with a problem-solving attitude, which means that we tend to select a number of themes of this kind and look at them in an interdisciplinary but also multimedia way. So, for example, we tend to look at race and racism, and especially the Black Lives Matter movement. So we tend to study a number of Black authors from the past and the present, but also linking Black Lives Matter with previous anti-racist movements, such the civil rights movement in the US of the 1960s, but also the Harlem Renaissance of the 1920s and 30s. So we try and bring together a history of anti-racist mobilization, but also look at how the arts and culture are contributing to putting across this anti-racist message. So among the authors that we study, there is Claudia Rankine, who is a Jamaican-American author. She's a leading author, a leading Black author, very influential all over the world. And indeed, she's particularly interesting because she uses, although obviously she is a writer and she writes books, but she actually uses different media within her own literary enterprise. So for instance, she brings together visual cultures, paintings, but also videos, references. She makes references to videos on YouTube that have been made in conjunction with her work, but also independent videos that are relevant to the kind of things that she's discussing. Now, one interesting thing about this author is also that is quite interesting to develop to develop creative practice. Given that in the course there is also a dimension of creative practice, students are encouraged to, it is indeed part of the assessment, to produce a story, for instance, of 3,000 words. The students will pick a theme of their own choice. It will be a real-world issue of their own choice, and it could range from indeed. In fact, I am mentioning some of the things that have been chosen by students, including sexual assault, to indeed racism, and students then go on to learn a number of literary techniques that then they can apply to their own work, to their own story. So brought together these two dimensions. One is a critical one where students learn about how creative practitioners create materials that speaks to the Black Lives Matter movement or other movements of the past in terms of anti-racist mobilization. They learn about the context, and they learn about how to analyze a literary artifact. But also, they also take these literary artifacts as a model for their own creative practice. So, and when we study, for instance, Claudia Rankine's work, and in particular her book, Citizen, an American Lyric. In this book, for instance, we tend to look at the ways in which she creates plot, she creates settings, she develops characters, what kind of forms that she uses, because of course she tends to use different kinds of forms from poetry to essay writing, prose fiction, and indeed, as I mentioned earlier, also a lot of images and references to all sorts of materials or digital materials. When we study all these things, we obviously look at these works as models for the students' creative practice, and the students are able to pick a number of specific techniques. For instance, again, with Claudia Rankine, the great thing is that she narrates in the second person narration. I mean, she narrates in the second person. And by doing that, she is able to enable the reader or indeed make the reader feel the impact of racist microaggressions. So all of a sudden, the reader becomes the character, one character in the work, in the literary work. So, for instance, some students were able to borrow this technique. And for instance, I'm thinking in particular of a student that wrote a story about being, or at least the fear of being sexually assaulted. And indeed, she used the second person narrator in order to make the reader feel what it might be like to go through those fears. So it's always very exciting to see how students engage with the creative dimension of the course. And in fact, I think it's actually their favorite one. And every year they come up with very interesting and very intriguing stories. They are dealing with themes of their own choice, but still very much relevant to the contemporary world. And indeed, this is a very good way for students to actually engage with the contemporary world, with contemporaneity, both in terms of social issues as well as cultural production. So yeah, I think that on this basis, I can safely say this is one of the favorite modules of liberal arts students.